Dance with me, darling? Richard Blackwood III commanded his wife across the opulent ballroom, his voice dripping with the kind of entitlement that $500 million could buy. But his cruel gaze wasn't fixed on his socialite wife. It was locked on the black woman quietly arranging champagne glasses near the marble fireplace. Actually, no. Let's have some real entertainment tonight. You there! He pointed his crystal tumbler directly at 42-year-old Amara Johnson, who had been working as a housekeeper for the Blackwood estate for exactly 2 months. I bet you've never seen a real waltz in your life. The 150 guests at the Blackwood Mansion's annual charity gala, Manhattan's most exclusive social event, turned their heads in unison like vultures sensing fresh prey. The string quartet faltered mid-note, and even the servers stopped moving, sensing that something terrible was about to unfold. "Richard, please," whispered his 28-year-old son David, embarrassed by his father's public cruelty. But Richard Blackwood III hadn't built his real estate empire by listening to others, especially not his disappointingly soft-hearted heir. No, let me finish," Richard continued, stepping into the center of the ballroom as if claiming a stage. His wife, Catherine Blackwood, 48, winner of 3 consecutive charity waltz competitions, stood frozen beside him, her Botox-enhanced face unable to fully express her mortification. This woman probably thinks dancing means whatever they do at those urban clubs. But a waltz, the dance of civilization, I doubt she's ever seen one performed properly. Amara continued polishing glasses with steady hands, but those who looked closely could see something flickering in her dark eyes. Not fear or humiliation, but a strange kind of anticipation, as if she were calculating something the rest of the room couldn't comprehend. "Mr. Blackwood?" The event coordinator intervened nervously. "Perhaps we should." "Should what?" Richard cut him off with a theatrical gesture. "Should pretend that everyone in this room is equal? Should ignore the obvious differences in breeding and education?" He took a long sip of his $300 per bottle whiskey. "Here's what I propose. My wife Catherine will demonstrate a proper Viennese waltz. Then," he pointed again at Amara, "our staff member here can attempt to copy it. When she inevitably fails, she can apologize for wasting everyone's time and get back to work." Cruel laughter rippled through the crowd like a disease. Some guests covered their mouths in mock horror, but their eyes gleamed with the anticipation of free entertainment at someone else's expense. The men nodded approvingly, as if witnessing a perfectly acceptable display of social hierarchy. Amara finally stopped polishing glasses and looked directly at Richard Blackwood III. For a moment that stretched like eternity, she remained silent, studying his face with the intensity of someone solving a complex equation. "I accept," she said in a voice so clear and steady it cut through the ballroom like a conductor's baton. The room fell completely silent. Even the background hum of air conditioning seemed to pause. "What did you say?" Richard asked, his arrogance momentarily shaken by this unexpected response. "I said I accept your challenge," Amara repeated, this time with a subtle smile that sent an inexplicable chill down the spines of several guests. "But when I perform better than your wife, you'll acknowledge it publicly. And you'll apologize, not just to me, but to every person you've ever judged based on their job or the color of their skin." At that moment, while the crowd laughed even louder, thinking they were about to witness the most humiliating performance in Manhattan high society history, none of them noticed the familiar grace in Amara's posture. The same poise that had once commanded standing ovations at Vienna's State Opera House before a single moment of tragedy completely shattered her world. If this story of prejudice and shocking revelations is capturing your attention, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what's about to happen in that ballroom will prove that underestimating someone based on appearances can be the most devastating mistake a person can make. Richard's wife, Catherine, approached with a venomous smile that had been perfected through years of charity board meetings and country club politics. "Darling," she said, gesturing dismissively toward Amara, "do you really think I need to lower myself to compete with the help?" "Don't be modest, Catherine," Richard replied, clearly savoring every moment of the spectacle. "You won the Metropolitan Dance Society's Waltz Championship 3 years running. That should be more than sufficient for this little demonstration. Amara watched silently, but her mind traveled back 18 years to when she was known as Amara Volkov, principal dancer with the Vienna International Ballet Company. She remembered the nights when entire audiences rose in thunderous applause, the reviews that compared her to Anna Pavlova, the feeling of floating across the world's most prestigious stages. It had all ended on one rain-soaked night in Prague, an incident at the theater during a political event, 3 months in a Czech hospital, and the cruel awakening to a reality where her damaged right leg would never again support the demands of professional ballet. The doctors said she would be fortunate to walk without a limp. Dance professionally? Impossible. Return to the stage? A fantasy that would only cause more pain. David? Richard called to his son. Get your phone out. I want this recorded for posterity. The night a maid thought she could dance with Manhattan's elite. David hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation. Dad, this has gone too far. She was just doing her job. The maid, Richard corrected sarcastically, accepted the challenge. Now she's going to entertain us all. Or would you prefer I tell your fiancé about that embarrassing incident at the Princeton reunion last month? David's face paled. Amara realized that blackmail was just another tool in Richard's arsenal of control. Another demonstration of the toxic power he wielded over everyone in his orbit. Start the music, Richard ordered the string quartet. And gentlemen, place your bets. $500 says my wife wins by a landslide. 1,000 for anyone brave enough to bet on our domestic staff. Disgusting laughter echoed through the ballroom. Some guests actually began wagering money, treating the situation as dinner theater at someone else's expense. Catherine positioned herself in the center of the dance floor, executing a few theatrical stretches designed to showcase her experience and intimidate her opponent. You know what? Richard said, approaching Amara with a predatory grin. When you fail, and you will fail spectacularly, I want you to get on your knees and thank everyone here for giving you the privilege of embarrassing yourself in front of your betters. Then, obviously, you're fired and banned from working for any decent family in this city. It was at that precise moment that something shifted in Amara's eyes. The same determination that had driven her to master the most challenging choreography in classical ballet. The same strength that had sustained her through months of agonizing physical therapy just to walk normally again. The same dignity that had kept her spirit alive when she lost everything she had worked toward her entire life. Mr. Blackwood, she said with a calmness that sent an inexplicable shiver through some of those present. When I outperform your wife, and I will, I want you to keep your word about the public apology. But I also want something else. Richard raised his eyebrows, amused by her audacity. Oh, she's making demands now. How entertaining. What else could you possibly want besides keeping your job? I want you to donate $1 million to the American Ballet Foundation Scholarship Program for underprivileged children. And I want you to announce it publicly, in front of all these witnesses. The room tensed. Some guests whispered among themselves, recognizing that the situation had taken a more serious turn than they had anticipated. Richard laughed so loudly that several crystal glasses on nearby tables began to vibrate. You've got nerve, I'll grant you that. Fine. I accept your terms. But when you make a complete fool of yourself, you'll leave here with nothing. No job, no dignity, and certainly no $1 million fantasy. What Richard Blackwood III didn't know was that he was about to face not just a housekeeper with a mysterious past, but a woman who had lost everything once and understood exactly how hard it was to fight for every ounce of respect in a society that had rejected her the moment she became imperfect. While Catherine warmed up with competent but predictable ballroom dance moves, across the floor, a silent storm was brewing. Because there is a devastating difference between someone who learned to dance as a social accomplishment and someone who was born to make movement a universal language, even when fate tried to steal it away forever. James Morrison, 67, head of security for the Blackwood estate, watched from his position near the main entrance. 25 years of working high society events had taught him to recognize trouble before it exploded. But as he observed Amara's subtle preparatory movements, the way she unconsciously tested her weight distribution, the micro-adjustments of her posture, something familiar stirred in his memory. I know those movements, he murmured to himself, pulling out his phone. Not to record the humiliation, but to document what he suspected was about to become legend. Look at her, one guest whispered to her friend. She's probably never been to a dance lesson in her life. What unnecessary cruelty. Richard Blackwood circulated the room like a satisfied shark, collecting bets and deliberately amplifying the humiliation. 500 says she trips within the first 30 seconds, he announced, raising his glass. 1,000 for anyone who thinks she'll actually make it through the entire song without running away in tears. But Amara noticed something Richard didn't. His son David wasn't participating in the betting. In fact, the young man seemed increasingly distressed by the entire spectacle, shifting uncomfortably near the wall and avoiding eye contact with the crowd. It was then that she recognized something familiar about David's face. This wasn't the first time she had seen him. 2 months ago, when she started working at the Blackwood estate, she had noticed a young man who always treated the staff with respect, who learned their names, who thanked them genuinely for their work. It was him. Miss, a quiet voice said beside her. Amara turned to see James Morrison approaching discreetly, pretending to check something on his radio. I'm James, head of security. I've been working these events for 25 years. He moved closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I saw you dance before, 18 years ago at Lincoln Center when the Vienna International Ballet toured. Amara Volkov, principal soloist. I never forget a face or a performance like that. Amara's heart nearly stopped. Someone had recognized her. After all these years of hiding her identity, working anonymous jobs to survive, someone finally knew who she really was. I thought you were lost to us after that Prague incident, James continued, his eyes revealing a mixture of shock and deep respect. The reports said your injuries were career-ending. Reports said many things, Amara replied, keeping her voice steady. Not all of them were accurate. James nodded slowly. What they did to you was tragic. And what they're doing now? He glanced toward Richard, who was still laughing loudly with his guests. Is even worse, but they have no idea what they're about to witness. At that moment, Amara made a decision she had been avoiding for 18 years. Not just about dancing again, but about revealing who she truly was and what she was willing to risk to reclaim her dignity. James, she said, I need you to record everything that happens next. Not just my performance, but their reactions, especially Richard's response when this is over. He looked at her with growing understanding, then nodded. Absolutely. But may I ask why? Amara smiled genuinely for the first time that evening. Because some people need to learn that judging someone based on their current circumstances rather than their true worth can be the most expensive mistake they ever make. Meanwhile, Richard had decided to make the spectacle even more cruel. You know what? He shouted to the entire ballroom. Let's make this truly interesting. If she can complete the waltz without falling, stumbling, or giving up, I'll give her $1,000 bonus. But when she fails, and she absolutely will fail, I want her to clean this entire ballroom floor on her hands and knees while all of us watch. The crowd's reaction was a mixture of enthusiastic laughter and some uncomfortable murmurs. A few guests began to realize that the situation had crossed from entertainment into genuine cruelty, but none had the courage to confront Richard Blackwood III directly. Dad, David tried once more, approaching his father with determination. This has gone way too far. You're humiliating an innocent person for no reason. Shut up, David, Richard snapped, his mask of jovial cruelty slipping to reveal genuine anger. You're pathetically soft. This is exactly why you'll never successfully run this company. There's a natural hierarchy in this world, and people like her, he pointed at Amara, need to understand their place in it. It was at that moment that Amara began to move, not to position herself for dancing, but to stretch. Her movements were subtle, almost imperceptible to most of those present, but James recognized them immediately. They were the precise warm-up exercises she had performed before every major performance in Vienna. My God, James whispered to himself. She's actually going to do this. Catherine Blackwood, realizing that attention was beginning to focus on Amara, decided to begin her demonstration. "Start the music," she commanded the string quartet. "Let's finish this ridiculous charade." The musicians began playing a traditional Viennese waltz. Catherine commenced dancing alone, executing competent but entirely predictable ballroom steps. She had learned to dance at expensive private clubs with costly instructors, but her technique was clearly amateur by professional standards. Still, she received polite applause from the audience. After all, to these people, she represented everything they considered proper. Wealthy, white, educated in the finest social circles. "Beautifully done, darling," Richard said, applauding with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Now it's time for our featured performer." Amara slowly walked to the center of the dance floor. Each step was measured, controlled, loaded with a dignity that began to make some of those present genuinely uncomfortable. This was not how a defeated person was supposed to behave. "What music would you prefer?" asked the first violinist, more out of professional courtesy than genuine consideration. "The same piece," Amara replied simply. "But please, play it from the beginning." Richard laughed triumphantly. "Oh, she wants a fresh start. How thoughtful of us to give her every possible advantage." "Very well," he announced to the room. "Start the music. Let's see how long she lasts before she realizes she's completely out of her depth." What none of them knew was that Amara had strategically chosen that particular waltz for a very specific reason. It was Strauss's The Blue Danube, a piece she had performed hundreds of times during her career with the Vienna International Ballet. One of the compositions she knew by heart, which flowed through her muscle memory like breathing itself. More importantly, it was the final piece she had ever performed professionally before the Prague incident. A performance that had received a 7-minute standing ovation and been called transcendent by critics who compared it to the greatest achievements in dance history. As she waited for the music to begin, Amara closed her eyes and allowed her memories to transport her back to that final night 18 years ago. She remembered the sensation of weightlessness across the stage, the profound connection with each musical phrase, the absolute certainty that she had been born to transform music into physical poetry. The doctors had said she would never dance again. The media had declared her career definitively finished. She herself had believed them for years, until slowly, painfully, she began to rebuild not only her damaged muscles but her relationship with the art form that had defined her existence. She had never returned to professional performing. She had never attempted to resume her career, but she had never stopped dancing in private, alone, during the most difficult moments of her new life, when movement was the only thing that kept her spirit from dying completely. The music began, and with it, something extraordinary was about to happen in that ballroom full of prejudice and arrogance. Under the weight of all those condescending stares, Amara's hands positioned themselves with a precision that made several of the musicians pause mid-note, instinctively recognizing that they were about to witness something far beyond amateur ballroom dancing. But what none of them could have imagined was that those opening measures would mark not only the rebirth of a lost legend, but the moment when the entire power structure of that room would be permanently and irreversibly shattered. The first notes of The Blue Danube filled the ballroom, and Amara began to move. It was not the hesitant, uncertain steps everyone expected to see. Instead, she rose onto the balls of her feet with a grace that made the very air in the room seem to shimmer, as if gravity had suddenly become negotiable. Her opening movements were deceptively simple, allowing the audience to maintain their low expectations. But as the waltz gained momentum, something extraordinary began to unfold. Each step became more fluid, each turn more precise, each gesture infused with an emotional depth that began to mesmerize everyone present. Richard Blackwood stopped laughing. Catherine stopped smiling. The entire room began to understand that they weren't watching a housekeeper attempting to dance. They were witnessing an artist reclaiming her throne. "Dear God," someone in the audience whispered. She's magnificent." Amara executed a series of chasses across the floor that would challenge any professional dancer, followed by a grand jeté that lifted her into the air with a lightness that seemed to defy physics. These weren't ballroom dance steps. This was classical ballet of the highest order, masterfully adapted to the three-quarter rhythm of the waltz. James Morrison, keeping his promise to document everything, positioned his phone to capture not only the performance but the audience's reactions, especially Richard Blackwood's face, which had transformed from mockery to confusion to something approaching terror. "This is impossible," Richard whispered, his voice barely audible. "Who the hell is this woman?" It was when Amara performed a sequence of fouettes, rapid turns on one leg that required extraordinary technique and years of training, that recognition began to dawn on some of the more cultured guests. "Wait," said Eleanor Pemberton, a major patron of the Lincoln Center who attended every significant cultural event in the city. "I've seen those movements before. That technique? But where?" David Blackwood was completely transfixed, his phone capturing every second of the performance. Unlike his father, he recognized genius when he witnessed it, regardless of who was displaying it or what circumstances had brought them to this moment. When the music reached its crescendo, Amara performed her signature move, a combination she had created herself during her Vienna years. It was a series of split leaps that flowed seamlessly into spinning turns, finishing with a dramatic arabesque that demonstrated not only perfect technique, but extraordinary emotional expression. The ballroom had become completely silent except for the soaring music. This was the kind of silence that occurs when an audience realizes they are witnessing something that transcends their wildest expectations, something that will be remembered and talked about for years to come. As the final notes of the waltz echoed through the ballroom, Amara concluded with a pose that was simultaneously powerful and vulnerable. Her arms extended like wings, her head held high with absolute dignity, her breathing controlled despite the intense physical demands of the performance. The silence that followed lasted an eternity. It was the profound quiet that follows a performance so exceptional that applause seems inadequate. Then, slowly, Eleanor Pemberton began to clap. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted in thunderous applause. Guests leaped to their feet, clapping with an intensity that made the crystal chandeliers chime. "Bravo!" someone shouted. "Extraordinary!" echoed another voice. "Incredible!" came from multiple directions. Richard Blackwood stood frozen, pale as marble, realizing that he had just been completely and publicly humiliated by someone he had considered beneath his notice. Worse, he had orchestrated this humiliation himself, in front of Manhattan's elite, who now looked at him with a mixture of disapproval and genuine embarrassment. It was at that moment that James Morrison approached Amara, still recording with his phone held high. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear clearly, "allow me to introduce Amara Volkov, former principal soloist with the Vienna International Ballet Company." The name exploded through the ballroom like a detonation. Several people gasped audibly. Others exclaimed in shock and recognition. Amara Volkov had been a legend, a ballerina who had mysteriously disappeared at the height of her international career after the tragic Prague incident. "Impossible," Catherine Blackwood stammered, her voice shaking. "Amara Volkov is... She hasn't performed since the Prague incident. We all heard she could never dance again." "Clearly," Amara said, finally breaking her silence with a voice that carried the authority of someone who had commanded the world's greatest stages. "Reports of my artistic death have been greatly exaggerated." The audience laughed, but it wasn't mockery. It was the appreciative laughter of people who recognized wit and grace under pressure. Richard Blackwood, however, was not finding anything amusing. The full magnitude of what had happened was beginning to impact him like a series of physical blows. He had publicly humiliated one of the most celebrated artists in recent history, and it had all been recorded. "Mr. Blackwood," James said, still holding up his phone for everyone to see, "you stated that if she performed better than your wife, you would publicly apologize and donate $1 million to the Ballet Foundation. I believe this entire audience can testify that your conditions have been more than satisfied." David, realizing where the situation was headed, approached Amara with genuine respect. "Miss Volkov," he said, extending his hand, "I want to publicly apologize for my father's inexcusable behavior. It was cruel, unnecessary, and completely unacceptable." "David, shut your mouth," Richard exploded, his carefully constructed mask of control finally shattering completely. You will not apologize to anyone, especially not to the hired help. But it was too late. The room had heard everything, seen everything, and understood exactly what kind of man Richard Blackwood really was beneath his expensive suits and charitable donations. Mr. Blackwood, Amara said with the calm authority of someone who had faced down hostile audiences and critical reviews throughout her career. I believe we have a public apology and a charitable donation to discuss. After all, a man of your supposed stature surely honors his commitments, doesn't he? The ballroom fell silent again. But this time it was the tense quiet of people witnessing a reckoning. You must be insane if you think I'm going to honor what was obviously a joke, Richard growled, his arrogance returning in the form of desperate anger. Ah, but it wasn't a joke, Amara replied serenely. James, would you mind playing back the recording of Mr. Blackwood's exact words from this evening? James held his phone high enough for the entire room to hear as he replayed Richard's voice clearly stating the terms, escalating the conditions, adding humiliating details, and publicly declaring that he would apologize and donate money if she outperformed his wife. And here he is, the recording continued, confirming all the terms even after I specified additional conditions. The audience murmured among themselves, some laughing nervously, others clearly embarrassed by the situation Richard had created for himself through his own cruelty and arrogance. That's extortion? Richard shouted, completely losing his composure in front of Manhattan's social elite. No, Amara corrected calmly. This is accountability. You made a public wager with specific terms in front of 150 witnesses. Now you must decide whether you are a man of honor or whether your reputation is worth less than your prejudices. Eleanor Pemberton stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of old Manhattan money. Richard, the entire cultural community will be watching how you handle this situation. I suggest you consider that carefully. Other influential guests began murmuring their agreement. Richard Blackwood was quickly realizing that his social standing, the foundation of his business empire, was hanging in the balance. David moved closer to Amara, his respect for her growing with each passing moment. Miss Volkov, regardless of what my father decides, I want to personally ensure that the donation is made. Someone of your talent and dignity deserves better than this treatment. David, Richard screamed, his face turning purple with rage. If you donate 1 penny, you're out of the family business permanently. Then so be it, David replied without hesitation, looking directly at his father. Some things matter more than money, Dad, like basic human decency. Amara studied the young man's face, seeing something genuine there. A moral courage that had somehow survived growing up in Richard's toxic environment. Mr. Blackwood, she said, turning back to Richard. 18 years ago, people decided I had no value after I became injured. Tonight, you tried to humiliate me based on my job and the color of my skin. But you know what I've learned through all of this? The room waited in complete silence. True class doesn't come from bank accounts or bloodlines. It comes from how we treat other people when we think no one important is watching. And true strength isn't about having power over others. It's about maintaining your dignity when others try to take it away. She gestured toward David. Your son seems to understand this lesson, despite your best efforts to teach him otherwise. As for your apology and donation, Amara paused, letting the suspense build throughout the ballroom. I'll accept the apology when you're ready to give it genuinely. But the donation, she smiled. I've already arranged for that through other means. Sometimes the best way to defeat cruelty isn't to punish it, but to make it irrelevant by creating something beautiful in its place. The audience erupted in applause once again, but this time it wasn't just appreciation for her dancing. It was admiration for the grace and wisdom she had shown in victory. Richard Blackwood, realizing he had lost not only the confrontation but the respect of everyone present, including his own son, muttered something about lawsuits and stormed out of the ballroom, followed by Catherine, who was clearly mortified by the entire situation. James stopped recording and approached Amara with a broad smile. This is going to be very interesting when it reaches social media, he said. The entire world is about to learn what real class looks like. And as Manhattan's elite continued to process what they had just witnessed, a masterclass in dignity triumphing over prejudice, one question hung in the air. How would Richard Blackwood, a man who had built his empire on his reputation, survive when his cruelty and prejudice were exposed to the entire world? Within 24 hours, James Morrison's recording had exploded across every social media platform. Billionaire Humiliates ballet legend became a worldwide trending topic, accumulating over 50 million views in the first week alone. The comments section became a global conversation about prejudice, hidden worth, and the importance of treating all people with dignity. Richard Blackwood III woke up the next morning to discover that Blackwood Properties had lost $50 million in contracts overnight. His business partners were demanding an emergency board meeting, and his wife Catherine had moved out of their mansion, hiring the city's most expensive divorce attorney. "Dad," David said when he found his father in his study, surrounded by newspapers with devastating headlines like "The Fall of a Titan" and "When Arrogance Meets Karma." "The board has voted. You have 24 hours to resign voluntarily, or you'll be removed by force. The company's reputation can't survive this scandal." Richard looked at his son, seeing not submission for the first time, but moral clarity and strength. "You orchestrated this," he whispered hoarsely. "You destroyed me." "No, Dad," David replied with quiet conviction. "You destroyed yourself the moment you decided your wealth gave you the right to dehumanize another person. I just chose not to be complicit anymore." Meanwhile, Amara was being overwhelmed with opportunities that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. The Vienna State Opera had offered her a position as principal choreographer. The Metropolitan Opera wanted her to stage a comeback performance. 3 major film studios were competing to tell her story. Harvard Business School had invited her to give their commencement address about resilience and dignity. But the offer that moved her most deeply came from an unexpected source. The staff at the Blackwood estate had pooled their savings, collecting $847, to offer her a scholarship to start a dance academy for underprivileged children. "I'll take it," Amara said, tears streaming down her face. "But not your money. I'll fund it myself. And we'll call it the Second Chances Academy, because everyone deserves the opportunity to dance again, no matter what life has taken from them." 6 months later, the Second Chances Academy opened in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, funded by donations that poured in from around the world after Amara's story went viral. David Blackwood, now running a completely restructured version of his father's company focused on social responsibility and ethical business practices, was the Academy's largest benefactor. Richard Blackwood, meanwhile, had lost everything: his company, his reputation, his family, his social standing. He was last seen working as a night security guard at a shopping mall in New Jersey, a bitter shadow of the arrogant man who once believed money gave him the right to humiliate others. "You know what strikes me most about this entire story?" James Morrison said during the Academy's grand opening, watching Amara teach a class of enthusiastic children from diverse backgrounds. "It wasn't just a victory over prejudice. It was a demonstration of how true nobility responds to cruelty, not with revenge, but with grace that transforms everyone it touches." Amara, now recognized once again as one of the greatest dancers of her generation, smiled as she watched her students perform their first choreographed piece. "Sometimes," she reflected, "we have to lose everything to discover who we really are. And sometimes, others have to lose everything to learn who they should have been all along." David approached, carrying coffee and wearing the kind of genuine smile that had become his trademark since distancing himself from his father's toxic influence. "Ready for the board meeting?" he asked, offering his arm to escort her to their monthly planning session for the Academy. "Always," she replied, accepting not only his gesture but the new life she had built from the ashes of both triumph and tragedy. "You orchestrated this," he whispered hoarsely. "You destroyed me." "No, Dad," David replied with quiet conviction. "You destroyed yourself the moment you decided your wealth gave you the right to dehumanize another person. I just chose not to be complicit anymore." Meanwhile, Amara was being overwhelmed with opportunities that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. The Vienna State Opera had offered her a position as principal choreographer. The Metropolitan Opera wanted her to stage a comeback performance. 3 major film studios were competing to tell her story. Harvard Business School had invited her to give their commencement address about resilience and dignity. But the offer that moved her most deeply came from an unexpected source. The staff at the Blackwood estate had pooled their savings, collecting $847, to offer her a scholarship to start a dance academy for underprivileged children. "I'll take it," Amara said, tears streaming down her face. "But not your money. I'll fund it myself. And we'll call it the Second Chances Academy, because everyone deserves the opportunity to dance again, no matter what life has taken from them." 6 months later, the Second Chances Academy opened in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, funded by donations that poured in from around the world after Amara's story went viral. David Blackwood, now running a completely restructured version of his father's company focused on social responsibility and ethical business practices, was the Academy's largest benefactor. Richard Blackwood, meanwhile, had lost everything: his company, his reputation, his family, his social standing. He was last seen working as a night security guard at a shopping mall in New Jersey, a bitter shadow of the arrogant man who once believed money gave him the right to humiliate others. "You know what strikes me most about this entire story?" James Morrison said during the Academy's grand opening, watching Amara teach a class of enthusiastic children from diverse backgrounds. "It wasn't just a victory over prejudice. It was a demonstration of how true nobility responds to cruelty, not with revenge, but with grace that transforms everyone it touches." Amara, now recognized once again as one of the greatest dancers of her generation, smiled as she watched her students perform their first choreographed piece. "Sometimes," she reflected, "we have to lose everything to discover who we really are. And sometimes, others have to lose everything to learn who they should have been all along." David approached, carrying coffee and wearing the kind of genuine smile that had become his trademark since distancing himself from his father's toxic influence. "Ready for the board meeting?" he asked, offering his arm to escort her to their monthly planning session for the Academy. "Always," she replied, accepting not only his gesture but the new life she had built from the ashes of both triumph and tragedy.